Hi, and welcome back to Applied Behavior Analysis in Early Childhood. In the last unit, we covered behavior and environment. We defined each of them and then distinguished between the two. And now we're going to talk mostly about behavior. And back in the 1930s, and during his work in Harvard, B.F. Skinner wrote about two different kinds of behavior, two general types of behavior, respondent and operant. And operant behavior is behavior controlled primarily through consequences, and that's what we're going to discuss in the next unit. Operant behavior is largely what we're focused on in ABA practice or service delivery when we're working in schools or homes or community settings. And respondent behavior plays a role in ABA service delivery as well, but it's definitely there's definitely much less focus on respondent behavior in contemporary practice. Now, respondent behavior is different from operant behavior in that it's primarily or exclusively controlled by antecedent stimuli. So, respondent behavior consists of reflexes and reflex responses and stimuli that elicit those reflex responses. And one of the earliest pioneers in research on respondent behavior, specifically classical conditioning, was Ivan Pavlov. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this unit. And so let's begin by looking at some objectives here. So objective number 1 is going to be name the father of the concepts of the reflex and the stimulus. And then 2 is to define the reflex. 3 is to define unconditioned reflex response and list types of unconditioned reflexes. 3 is define unconditioned stimulus and list types of unconditioned stimuli. 5 is define, elicit, and discriminate between examples and non-examples of elicit. So objective 1 is to name the father of the concepts of the reflex and the stimulus. So it might help you to place what I'm about to tell you in context by pausing the video now and copying and pasting this link into your web browser and viewing this brief video for a few minutes on the gardens of Versailles in France. So go ahead and pause this lecture, check that video out, and then come on back. Alright, I'll assume you watched the video and you're back. And so the topic for today can be traced to the ancient royal gardens of France and 17th century philosopher René Descartes. Descartes is perhaps most famous for the saying, "I think, therefore I am." In the gardens were hydraulically controlled statues designed to entertain visitors, and hidden on the ground were plates, which if stepped on would change pressure in water through pipes to the statue, thereby causing the statue to move. Now, Descartes noticed a similarity between the movement of the statues triggered by the depressed plates and the movement of living organisms. The following is a translation of one of Descartes' observations of people walking through the garden. He said, "Entering into one of the grottos containing many fountains, themselves cause, without knowing it, the movements which they witness. For in entering, they necessarily tread on certain tiles or plates, which are so disposed that if they approach a bathing Diana, they cause her to hide in the rose bushes, and if they try to follow her, they cause a Neptune to come forward to meet them, threatening them with his trident." So Descartes thought of the relation between the plate and the statue's movement as analogous to the relation between a stimulus and an organism's response, such as when a drop of lemon juice on the tongue elicits salivation and puckering. For Descartes, just as a change in water pressure triggered by plate depression caused the statue to move, a stimulus in the environment triggered the activity of nerves and also, from his perspective at the time, animal spirits in living organisms. Now, most importantly, Descartes' observations led to 1, the concept of the reflex arc and the reflex, and 2, the new idea of the stimulus and a causal role of the environment on behavior, which was very different from the prior predominant view that human behavior was attributable to the soul. And later, physiologists would demonstrate that stimuli could elicit reflex responses even in non-living organisms such as frogs, which at least ruled out the necessary role of a soul in the behavior of non-human animals. So that's from the writing of Skinner in 1931. And so now I'm going to ask you a question here in ASR number 1. Who is the father of the reflex? Is it A. Bijou, B. Pavlov, C. Watson, or D. Descartes? A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. And the answer here is D. Descartes. And objective number 2 is to define reflex. Alright, now, a reflex is a reliable relation between an eliciting stimulus and a reflex response. So notice that a reflex isn't a stimulus, and a reflex isn't a response. It's the relation between the two. The strength of the reflex refers to the observed correlation of the activity of an effector, i.e. a response, with the observed forces affecting a receptor, i.e. a stimulus. That's from Skinner, 1931. In other words, a reflex is strong if a particular stimulus reliably and consistently evokes a response. Now, characterizations of the reflex, such as involuntary, unconscious, or, and this is an older characterization, restricted to special neural paths, are unscientific and we can reject them. That's what Skinner said. We don't need to characterize a reflex that way because it will, as you will see, it will be sufficient to just characterize the reflex as the relation, and specifically a reliable relation between an eliciting stimulus, i.e. an antecedent, and a reflex response. Okay. So reflexes can be conditioned or unconditioned. That means learned, conditioned, or unlearned, unconditioned. If you'd like to think of unconditioned as innate, that's fine too. It's due to natural selection. So the reflex can be represented by S, arrow, R. So notice that the reflex contains an eliciting stimulus and it contains a reflex response. So the reliable relation between the two is the reflex. Alright, so when you think reflex, don't think the S and don't think the R. Think about the arrow linking the S and the R. That's the reflex. There's a relation there. It says that the stimulus, and when you see the arrow, think reliably and consistently evokes. Okay? Stimulus reliably and consistently evokes. Reflex response. Alright? Don't look at the R and think reflex, because that's not what that means. That means reflex response. Arrow doesn't mean that S goes to R or something like that. No, when you see arrow, reliably and consistently evoke. And then this is the stimulus part of the reflex. It's an eliciting stimulus. So this S is not a reflex. The R, not a reflex. R to S, no, not a reflex. That's a free operant contingency, which we'll talk about in the next unit. Okay. So it's SR. S, arrow, R. Okay, so let's begin with the unconditioned reflex. This is a reflex that's not due to prior learning. It is of phylogenetic provenance. And it consists of an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned reflex response. Okay? Of phylogenetic provenance means that it's due to natural selection, or it's due to, it's innate. You were born being able to you were born with this reflex. Okay, so it can be symbolically represented as US, arrow to the right, UR. So an unconditioned stimulus elicits an unconditioned reflex response. So together that's an unconditioned reflex. Examples of unconditioned reflexes include a balloon pops behind you and you startle with no prior learning, or you bite the grapefruit and then you salivate. and you step on a nail and then your foot withdraws rapidly. So the unconditioned reflex is the relation between the balloon popping and you startling, or between the grapefruit juice on your tongue and salivation, or between the painful stimulation by the nail and the withdrawal of your foot. Or the nipple is brushed against the baby's upper lip and the baby opens his mouth to suckle. So in each of these cases, the unconditioned stimulus is the balloon popping, the grapefruit juice, the painful stimulus of the nail, the nipple brush against the baby's lip. But the reflex, unconditioned reflex response is the startle, the salivation, the foot withdrawal, and the baby opening the mouth. All right, so I think we're going to end this video part here. This is a short video part, and then we're going to resume the next video part with objective 3.